When Jim Churchill watched his cattle operation crumble, it wasn't just drought or rising feed costs that did him in, it was a flood of Argentine beef. What was pitched by the Trump administration as a way to stabilize prices ended up gutting the very producers it claimed to help. The sudden import surge forced domestic ranches like Hall Ranch Angus and Mallister Ranch into impossible corners, where thinner margins, mounting debts, and herd reductions became unavoidable. What's more devastating is that despite the influx of cheaper imports, consumer prices barely moved. Ranchers bore the brunt while grocery store shelves stayed expensive, exposing a policy misfire with no cushion for those on the ground. This isn't just a story about failed trade tactics, it's about the structural disconnect between government decisions and rural livelihoods. With cattle herds at their lowest since the 1950s and entire operations like Lazy T Ranch folding under pressure, the cracks in America's agricultural backbone are undeniable. Emergency loans, drought insurance, and policy tweaks came too late or fell short, revealing how fragile rural economies become when global markets shift faster than Washington can respond. These collapses offer a hard lesson. Food policy must account for more than price tags. It has to protect the people who make food possible. Let's be brutally clear, Donald Trump just sold out American ranchers, and they're paying for it with their land, their herds, and their livelihoods. 5 of the largest cattle ranches in the U.S. have collapsed, not because of drought alone, not just inflation, but because of a reckless, short-sighted import deal cooked up by Trump's administration to bring in cheap Argentine beef. That's right, another America First policy that somehow ends with Americans losing everything. The goal, supposedly, to bring down beef prices for consumers. The reality, retail prices are still sky high, while U.S. ranchers are being crushed under the weight of foreign competition. Hall Ranch Angus, Churchill Cattle, Lazy T Ranch, Mallister Ranch, gone or gutted. Their stories tell the real tale of what happens when you try to solve a grocery bill problem with a trade bombshell. This wasn't a policy designed to help Americans. It was a political stunt disguised as economic relief. The plan dumped cheap Argentine beef into the U.S. market, flooding it so fast that domestic ranchers couldn't adjust. These operations, already battling rising feed costs, drought, and interest rates, suddenly had to compete with imports priced well below their cost of production. How is that a level playing field? And here's the kicker, while American ranchers lost everything, beef prices at the grocery store barely moved. Consumers didn't see meaningful relief, but foreign beef processors, they made a killing, and Trump's cronies got their photo ops. Another deal that helped the few and destroyed the many. U.S. cattle herds have now shrunk to their lowest levels in almost 70 years, sitting at just 86 million head. Let that sink in. 70 years of progress, family traditions, and domestic food independence, wiped out by a president who claimed to protect the farmer, but actually opened the floodgates for foreign imports that devastated rural America. This is what happens when you govern by headlines instead of reality. When you chase inflation optics instead of economic truth. Trump's deal wasn't about long-term food security or helping rural families. It was about quick wins and empty press conferences. Meanwhile, the people who raise the cattle, live on the land, and feed the country are being forced off their ranches. These aren't just statistics. These are families. Families who have run operations for generations. Families who saw cattle prices tank, feed prices skyrocket, and interest rates climb. Families who waited on drought insurance and emergency loans that came too little, too late, if they came at all. The federal response? Toothless. Emergency loans were too slow. Meatpacking reforms were half-baked. Insurance didn't cover the real cost of losses. None of it could stop the wave of liquidation, the selling of herds, the shutting down of operations. Government action lagged behind economic reality. They call it lag friction. Ranchers call it betrayal. This wasn't just bad policy. It was destructive policy. It wasn't just a missed opportunity. It was a direct hit on rural economy. And yet, we're still being told this was a success story. Still being fed the line that this is just the cost of doing business in global markets. No, this is the cost of bad leadership. Rural communities have been left picking up the pieces. Entire towns are feeling the ripple effects. When a ranch shuts down, it's not just the family that suffers, it's the feed supplier, the equipment dealer, the local school, the corner store. Communities built around agriculture are bleeding, all because Washington thought it could buy consumer goodwill with imported beef, while ignoring the backbone of domestic food production. And here's where the hypocrisy hits a new low. While domestic producers were drowning, the Trump administration was busy touting America's strength and self-reliance. Self-reliance, when you undercut your own cattle industry with foreign imports. That's not self-reliance, it's sabotage. The collapse of 5 major ranches is just the tip of the iceberg. Thousands of small and mid-sized ranches are hanging on by a thread. These are the folks with razor-thin margins, often family-run, and now forced to sell off herds just to survive another season. The system wasn't built to support them in the first place, but Trump's policy made sure they wouldn't make it to the next election. And let's talk about the scam of the supposed relief measures. Drought insurance tied to rainfall metrics didn't cover forage loss. Country of origin labeling still lacks transparency, making it harder for consumers to support American-raised beef. Emergency loans went out months after operations had already shuttered. These aren't solutions, they're headlines masquerading as help. All of this points to one brutal reality. The people in charge didn't listen. They didn't listen to the ranchers. They didn't listen to the economists warning about market volatility. They didn't listen to rural communities who said we need support now. Instead, they doubled down on flashy trade deals and let the consequences fall on everyone else. And let's be clear, this wasn't just an economic failure, it was a moral one. When government prioritizes the illusion of cheap prices over the survival of those who feed us, we've crossed a dangerous line. There is, however, one thing Washington didn't count on: the resilience of these communities. Despite being battered from every angle, despite losing land, herds, and financial stability, rural America isn't giving up. Co-ops are forming, communities are banding together to buy land, pool resources, and stay connected. Because they know what Washington has forgotten. Food security doesn't start with trade, it starts with people. The fact that this community spirit still burns, even after everything they've endured, is proof that rural America is still alive and still worth fighting for. But that fight can't be waged alone. It needs leaders who understand that economic indicators mean nothing when people are losing their homes. It needs policies that actually meet the moment, not just pad the resumes of politicians chasing another round of applause. This entire crisis is a case study in how global trade policy, when driven by headlines instead of strategy, can destroy local industries. It's a warning for every future policymaker. You cannot stabilize an economy by destabilizing its foundation. What we've seen is that the connection between international trade and rural sustainability is not a theory, it's a lived experience for every American rancher who watched their livelihood collapse while foreign beef lined the shelves. And the economic stats, they don't tell the real story. Wall Street may say the economy is stable, but Main Street is watching the lights go out. Ranchers are selling off legacy herds. Communities are losing anchor businesses. Families are leaving land that's been in their name for generations. That's not stability, that's erosion. And it started the moment this administration decided that cheap imports were more important than American producers. Let's stop pretending this is just about beef. It's about priorities. It's about a government that chose photo ops over policy and global deals over domestic survival. Trump promised to protect the American farmer. What he delivered was a death blow to the cattle industry. And now we're watching the fallout unfold. One ranch, one community, one lost legacy at a time. The message is loud and clear. We cannot let political theater dictate food policy. We cannot let reckless trade deals destroy what generations have built. And we sure as hell can't let another administration get away with pretending this didn't happen. If you believe in American agriculture, in rural families, in honest work and fair markets, then don't let this story go unheard. Like, share, subscribe, and drop a comment below if you're from a ranching family or you've seen this kind of devastation firsthand. Your voice matters. Let's make sure Washington hears it loud and clear. How is it that 5 of the largest ranches in the country collapse within the same window? under the same policies, and not one person in power steps up to take responsibility. Hall Ranch Angus was a fourth-generation operation gone. Lazy T Ranch had weathered recessions, droughts, and wildfires, but not. Jim Churchill's family ran cattle across the same land for decades, forced to liquidate. Mollister Ranch shuttered. These are not small inefficiencies in a system. These are alarm bells, and they're screaming. This is what happens when leadership treats agriculture like a commodity and not a lifeline, when rural communities are expected to take all the risk, bear all the cost, and still be grateful for whatever crumbs get thrown from Washington. It's insulting, it's devastating, and it's happening right now. You'd think a deal that obliterated this many ranches would prompt a full-scale policy review. You'd think Congress would be holding hearings. You'd think the Department of Agriculture would be reassessing every angle, but instead, silence. A handful of press releases, maybe a few thoughts and prayers tweets. Meanwhile, entire counties are watching their economic foundation collapse. Because let's not forget, cattle ranching isn't just some boutique industry. It's food, it's jobs, it's land management, it's ecosystem health, and in many rural towns, it's the only thing keeping the lights on. When a ranch closes, everything else feels it. Feed mills go under, fencing companies lose contracts, local banks stop lending, schools shrink, and the slow bleed of rural decline turns into a gaping wound. And for what? For a deal that didn't even work. Retail beef prices are still climbing. Consumers were told this deal would mean cheaper burgers. It didn't. They were told food inflation would slow. It hasn't. The only ones who profited were the importers and the meat packers, many of them foreign-owned, mind you, who pocketed the difference while domestic producers ate the loss. And now, the U.S. cattle herd is down to 86 million. That's not a small dip. That's a generational low. That's how many cattle were in the country back in the 1950s, when the population was half what it is today. So while the demand for beef has grown, the domestic supply has shriveled. That's not just a supply chain issue waiting to happen. That's a food security crisis in slow motion. But if you turn on the TV, you'll still hear pundits saying this is just the market adjusting. Adjusting, that's what they call it, when families lose land, herds, and hope. No, this is sabotage disguised as strategy. And let's talk about those emergency loans and band-aid programs they keep throwing at the problem. These ranchers didn't need loans after they sold off their herds. They needed help before the banks came knocking. They didn't need relief once they were already forced into liquidation. They needed protection before their cost margins imploded. This is where Washington fails again and again, responding too late, too slowly, with too little. They roll out programs that sound good on paper but hit the ground months after the damage is done. Drought insurance that doesn't cover actual losses, feed subsidies that can't compete with inflated costs, and reforms that conveniently exclude the very operations being driven out of business. The disconnect is staggering. Politicians keep pointing to economic growth, GDP numbers, stock market gains, while American producers are selling off breeding stock just to cover debt. They act like agriculture is strong because the exports are up, ignoring that the strength is coming from imports, replacing local production. That's not strength, that's displacement. And the country of origin labeling, still a mess. Consumers walk into a grocery store thinking they're buying American beef. In reality, much of that meat is processed here, but raised elsewhere, meaning it gets a U.S. label without ever having touched an American pasture. That's not transparency, that's deception, and it makes it nearly impossible for people to support their local producers, even when they want to. This all adds up to one brutal truth. The system isn't broken, it's rigged. Rigged to favor mega packers, rigged to reward importers, rigged to ignore rural communities, and it's been that way for a long time. But Trump's Argentina beef deal took that rigged system and turned it into a wrecking ball. The timing couldn't have been worse. Ranchers were already dealing with drought. Feed prices had already soared. Operating costs were up. Interest rates were climbing. And then bam, flood the market with cheap imports. And act surprised when domestic operations collapse under the weight.
Yeah.
It's not just bad economics, it's policy malpractice. And while ranchers were liquidating herds, the federal government was playing politics with food security, pretending everything was under control, pretending the free market would correct itself. But here's what they don't get. There's no correcting a liquidated herd. There's no adjusting. When a multi-generational operation closes, you don't just restart a cattle ranch like rebooting a computer. It takes years to rebuild, if it ever happens at all. But the ranchers aren't just victims in this story. They're fighters. What you see now in these devastated communities isn't surrender, it's adaptation. Co-ops being formed to buy land, shared equipment, and labor agreements. Local food networks trying to bypass the broken supply chain entirely. It's grassroots resilience in the face of federal negligence. These efforts are heroic, but they shouldn't be necessary. This isn't how a country that claims to value agriculture should treat its food producers. The burden shouldn't be on ranchers to hold the system together while Washington plays games. What we need, what we should demand, is targeted policy that reflects reality. Biosecurity measures that matter, insurance that pays when it's supposed to, trade policy that protects not punishes domestic producers, transparent labeling so Americans can choose U.S.-raised beef with confidence, and leadership that listens to the people who work the land, not just the lobbyists in D.C. Because the next crisis is already on the horizon. Feed prices aren't going down, land costs are up, climate shocks are intensifying, and without a serious shift in how we support agricultural resilience, we're going to lose more than just 5 ranches. We're going to lose our ability to feed ourselves, and that's the final insult here. For all the talk of national security, we've allowed our food system to become dependent on foreign supply chains. We've let trade agreements dictate what ends up on our shelves, even when that means gutting the very industries that could provide it domestically. It's not just about beef, it's about sovereignty, stability, survival, and if that sounds dramatic, it's because it is. The fall of these ranches isn't just a bad economic indicator, it's a warning, a flashing red light, and unless we start listening, really listening, to the people being crushed by these policies, we're going to see a lot more headlines like this. So what now? Now we fight for the truth. We raise hell about the betrayal. We stand with the ranchers who are still standing, and we honor those who were forced to walk away. We demand smarter policy, more transparency, real support, and we tell this story over and over until the people in power can't ignore it anymore. Because this didn't have to happen, and it damn sure better not happen again. Here's the truth. No one in Washington wants to admit you don't rebuild rural America with slogans. You don't save family farms with half-baked stimulus checks or performative town halls, and you sure as hell don't stabilize a struggling industry by undercutting it with foreign imports while patting yourself on the back for fighting inflation. What happened to these ranches wasn't an accident. It was the natural outcome of a government that treats rural producers like a statistic instead of a priority, and it's happening across the board, whether it's cattle, corn, wheat, or dairy. The people who feed this country are being sacrificed on the altar of global competition, while billion-dollar corporations write the rules behind closed doors. And Trump, he's still out there claiming to be the champion of the American worker, still ranting about bringing jobs back, about fighting for Main Street. But when he had the chance to stand up for American cattle ranchers, he didn't. He cut a deal with Argentina that gutted the domestic market. He ignored the warning signs, and when the fallout hit, he went silent. Where was the outrage then? Where was the support when ranchers were selling off breeding stock they'd spent decades building? Where was the emergency response before entire communities went under? Nowhere. Because it was never about protecting the American farmer. It was always about the optics, the headlines, the illusion of strength, while real families were going bankrupt. Meanwhile, the ranchers who are left, they're running leaner than ever, working longer hours, cutting costs, watching every penny, trying to survive in a market that's stacked against them. And still, they get up before dawn. They keep the lights on. They feed this country with pride and grit, and the work ethic Washington couldn't begin to understand. But they shouldn't have to do it alone. They shouldn't have to fight their own government just to stay afloat. And this moment, this collapse of 5 major ranches, is a line in the sand. We either start treating domestic agriculture like the national security asset it is, or we accept a future where our food is controlled by foreign markets, corporate monopolies, and political whims. That's not fear-mongering. That's the direction we're headed if we don't wake up. So if you're tired of the excuses, the failures, say something. Share this. Talk about it. Post it. Tell your friends. Tell your neighbors. Let's make enough noise that even the people in D.C.
can't pretend this crisis didn't happen. We owe it to the ranchers who lost everything. We owe it to the families still hanging on. And we owe it to ourselves, because once the land is gone, once the herds are liquidated, there's no getting them back. Hit the like button, subscribe for more hard truths, and drop a comment if you're done watching American agriculture get sold off piece by piece, because silence is how we got here. Speaking up is how we fight back.